This is an advertisement by BetterHelp. January arrives with a sense of expectation and change. But real change is rarely loud or dramatic.
It's noticing what no longer needs to be there. Thoughts you keep turning over even when they're not helping.
And when you live with those long enough, they can start to feel normal until you pause and see them more clearly. That's where perspective helps. Not fixing yourself, just creating space to understand what's been weighing you down.
Therapy can offer that space, a clearer view of your own patterns and what's worth holding on to. BetterHelp makes starting straightforward. You answer a few questions and they match you with a qualified therapist. If it doesn't feel right, you can switch at any time.
Whether you're into New Year's resolutions or not, working to better yourself is something everyone should do. And you don't even need to bulldoze your life to do it. Simply use BetterHelp.
BetterHelp makes it easy to get matched online with a qualified therapist. Sign up and get 10% off at betterhelp.com/restishistory. That's betterhelp.com/restishistory. This episode is brought to you by the Financial Times. When it comes to news, it's easy to find out what, who, where, and when. But why is harder. FT journalism goes deeper to help you see the whole story and understand the issues that matter. Why did it happen? Why is it important? Why will it matter?
Listeners to The Rest is History can save over 40% on an annual digital subscription to the Financial Times by visiting ft.com/history. For the why, Financial Times.
This podcast is brought to you by Carvana. Car shopping shouldn't feel like preparing for a marathon of paperwork. That's why Carvana makes buying and financing your car easy. From start to finish, search thousands of vehicles with great prices. All online, all on your time. And when you're ready, your new car shows up right at your door. It doesn't get better than that. Buy your car the easy way. On Carvana. Delivery fees may apply.
Toward the end of the 19th century, in the United States and Britain, a great threshold was crossed for the first time in the history of our species. Non-infectious causes of death, cancer, cardiovascular disorders, and other chronic and degenerative diseases accounted for a greater portion of total mortality than did infectious diseases. By 1915, an American social reformer could observe that a generation ago we would only vainly mourn the deaths of children from disease. Today we know that every dying child accuses the community. The knowledge is available for keeping alive and well so nearly all that we may justly be said to sin in the light of the new day when we let any die. By mid-century, dying of infectious disease had become anomalous, virtually scandalous in the developed world. That is from Plagues Upon the Earth, Disease and the Course of Human History, a brilliant new book by Kyle Harper, who is Professor of Classics at the University of Oklahoma and wrote a fantastic book, The Fate of Rome, in which he looks at how disease impacted on the fall of the Roman Empire. Kyle is with us. Kyle, this book, Plagues Upon the Earth, I mean, it's on a vast scale. We go from Homo erectus, so the earliest ancestors of Homo sapiens, right the way up to COVID. And that passage that I read, it's a kind of reminder to us how unusual it is that actually we're not all dying of infectious diseases. And presumably you wrote this book against the backdrop of COVID.
Yes, and no to your last question. And hi, thanks for inviting me to be here. I'm thrilled. And the book is a COVID book and isn't a COVID book. So I started it in 2017 when it was going to be a kind of project that I spent several years thinking about and then writing, and a little bit of a abstruse academic topic, the history of infectious disease that would have as its kind of finale a warning that the patterns of history should be another reason why we should obviously expect that there'll be a new pandemic. So it wasn't born as a COVID book, but it came to completion certainly under the shadow of COVID, which was pretty bizarre, pretty surreal to end up with a book that was far more urgent and resonant than I ever imagined when I started writing it.
So you have this incredible passage where you say that, there have basically been, it's extraordinary to think about it, actually. There have been 10,000 generations of human beings, basically. And for all but the last 3 or 4, the big killer was infectious disease. I mean, infectious disease was your biggest fear. And that we and our parents and grandparents are completely anomalous in the course of human history, in that we have, until COVID actually, which confronted us, forced us to sort of stare into the abyss that once confronted our predecessors, we were kind of insulated from that. So in some ways, can you genuinely divide human history, do you think, into a before and after in that way?
I think it's one of the most fundamental transformations in human existence. The way we die has so fundamentally changed. This is sometimes called the mortality transition, and it happens first in the UK and US and Western Europe, and then increasingly across the entire globe. And it's still incomplete. Of course, even in the societies today with the lowest life expectancy at birth has nearly tripled. So there has been important global progress everywhere, but it is uneven around the globe. But it's still, in the big picture, the most fundamental change, because it affects everything else. The fact that women don't have to have 6 children on average just to replace the population. The fact that you don't have to go through the experience of losing half to a third of your children. The fact that you can invest and send kids to school for 20 years to become Roman historians or something requires a kind of stability and predictability. So it's changed our ideas around pain and suffering and predictability. There's nothing that this doesn't change. It changes everything. It allows the empowerment of women. And so it's easy for us to take it for granted. It's amazing. It really is only 3 or 4 generations ago. But how quickly we've come to build into all of our expectations about life that we shouldn't die of smallpox or tuberculosis or plague or something. Because
Kyle, I mean, when you, obviously the past 2 years, interest in the history of disease and the relationship of humans to disease has just gone through the roof. But really before that, there was a sense that disease is something that you can kind of park, that it's a distinct area of human history separate from everything else. History of medicine, history of disease, whatever. But the argument of your book basically is that humanity's relationship to pathogens, to organisms that essentially can kill us, it's the history of everything. It's the history, I mean, you say the history of migration, of power, of poverty and prosperity, of progress and its unintended consequence. And that this is a history that goes back way, way before the emergence of Homo sapiens, that it goes back to our kind of ancestral ape ancestors.
Right. And I mean, I try to look at human beings and human history the way that a biologist would, and particularly the way a disease ecologist would, because really, if you sort of lose our human arrogance and remember that we're organisms that are part of the web of life, we're part of nature like any other living being. If you look at us objectively from the outside, we are very weird, and we usually think of our uniqueness in terms of our big brains and all of the good things. But, if you're a chimp looking at us, our closest relative is the chimp, you might say, my goodness, that ape has so many infectious diseases. That is the germiest creature. I need to stay away. And one of the really important ways in which we are weird, just speaking objectively, looking at us the way a biologist would, is that we have a huge number of pathogens that cause disease in us.
So much more than other apes.
Much more than other apes. And not only that, but we have a lot of them that are they're obsessed with us, like a creepy stalker. They really only care about us. A lot of pathogens in nature can't be too picky because you have to be able to infect different hosts. But a lot of pathogens, think measles, smallpox, really, really have a narrow host range or exclusively can infect humans. That's very weird. And then it's very weird how virulent many of our diseases are. In nature, pathogens are always evolving constantly, and more or less virulent strains emerge. But there are some kind of limits on the ability of pathogens to become so virulent that they kill their host so quickly that they can't survive. And so apes and a lot of animals have some really, really nasty pathogens. But we've just got a lot of really, really virulent diseases. So looking at ourselves objectively, we are weird. And one of the really important ways is the human disease pool.
Why is that so broad? Is that to do with what becomes our history?
The one word answer is history. Chimps 100,000 years ago had the same diseases that they have today. Mutatis mutandis. There's always evolution, but chimps 100,000 years ago lived and died in pretty much the same way because they had the same biology and the same technology. Whereas humans 100,000 years ago did not have the same diseases. All of these diseases that I've already mentioned, measles, smallpox, tuberculosis, plague, malaria, are products of the recent past. And the reason why we have the diseases we have is because of history, in the sense of the ongoing technological development that our species has led. So we live completely different lifestyles. We get our food differently. We live in different habitats. We live in
so that's the key thing, isn't it? One of the key to begin with is that we migrate and we occupy kind of ecological niches that our distant ancestors didn't.
Yeah, most primates are pretty stuck where they are because they evolve and adapt to their environment. They get food from, the kind of whatever forest they live in. Chimps are very good at finding bugs to eat and fruit and occasionally a little monkey. But they're so hardwired to live in that ecological surrounding that's it. I mean, a chimp population can't pick up and say, well, maybe we should go live in the savannah today, or let's check out the Arctic tundra, see if there's some food up there. Whereas humans are, one of our most distinctive characteristics is that our intelligence and social capacities and technology lets us change the natural ecology in ways that benefit us, lets us exploit radically different environments. So we are a cosmopolitan ape, and that very fact exposes us to a huge range of potential diseases that is sort of what gets the ball rolling in terms of creating a unique and distinct human disease pool.
You mentioned our use of fire in your book as one of the sort of things that, crucial technological, I suppose you would say, innovation. How does that shape our relationship with disease?
Yeah, it's in some ways it's the kind of technology. Humans are not the only animal that uses technology. Chimps use sticks to dig up ants and so on. So technology is not uniquely human, but human ancestors before Homo erectus had tools, very, very simple, primitive tools. But fire is sort of the revolutionary technology. It puts a power in our hands that is unlike anything else in nature. It makes us the only animal that consumes energy through both metabolism and combustion. It lets us migrate. So it's what gives us the power to live in environments where otherwise it would be too cold, or where otherwise the flora would be too dense. We can just burn it down. It keeps predators away from us. It lets us build other technologies like ultimately metallurgy. So fire is sort of the technology that in many ways sets the history of human technology on a different path. So it's the technology. And in that sense, I would say technology is one of the great driving forces of human history. And it's certainly one of the great driving forces that lets us change the environments we live in. And when we do that, nature will respond. Microbes are pervasive. They're everywhere. They're always evolving. They evolve fast. I mean, COVID-19 has been the best sort of public education project for understanding the evolution of in this case, viruses. But evolution is constant and fast. That's how we end up with these new variants. And so anytime humans change the environment, when we move to a new ecosystem, we're burning it down, we're extracting food, and we're also exposing ourselves to new pathogens, driving their evolution. And fire is really what gets all of that going.
Carl, have you played a computer game called Civilization?
No, but I know it. Yeah.
Well, you know, the kind of the way you begin with hunter gatherers and then you kind of progress to spaceships going to Alpha Centauri, and it's done as a kind of sequence of amazing technological, cultural leaps or whatever. But reading your book, I thought, you know, the history of humanity could just as readily be described as the expansion of diseases that can prey on us. So if we begin with hunter gatherers, this idea that they are living in harmony with nature is not entirely true. In fact, they are going into habitats that are generating all kinds of new diseases, of which I think malaria is the most lethal. Is that right?
I mean, I'm sorry that I have to pile on the hunter gatherers, because they had a real moment in the 60s and 70s when it was quite popular to say that hunter gatherers had it figured out. They didn't have private property. They were kind of open about their sexuality. They moved around a lot. They ate a very healthy.
They're basically hippies. Yeah.
They're sort of bohemian paleo diet, healthy, living in harmony with nature. So that's a bit of a caricature, but there really is this sort of story that will never go away. And one of the reasons it won't go away is because there's some truth to it, that agriculture is this huge catastrophic fall from grace. And we can come back to the ways that's true and not true. But hunter-gatherer societies, we've come to really understand, were a lot more varied. There was inequality. There was ecological violence as well as violence against humans. There was war. And our species has sort of expansionist tendencies. And another way in which we can sort of pile on the hunter-gatherers is they were not living in a kind of disease-free paradise. Now, that said, there were clearly some limits because hunter-gatherer societies tended to be small. They didn't have the energy technologies to build cities or to build really, really big, dense populations. And they moved around a lot, which isn't always a bad idea if you're trying to avoid germs, to move away from your waste. But hunter-gatherers, if we again look at them like a biologist, they have lots of germs, and there's a lot of reasons why it's hard to know what Pleistocene people's lifestyles were like and what germs they had. But there are ways to get at that question, and most of them leave us with the answer that human hunter-gatherers already had a lot of infectious diseases, and the burden of infectious diseases is already quite high. And in some cases, one of the really revolutionary things that's happening is that genetics is letting us know about a lot of things about the evolutionary history of our germs, including giving us a better and better sense of how old some of them are. And it's increasingly evident that that while a lot of our pathogens are very, very young, some are sort of in the middle. They're not like just timeless. They don't go back to, millions of years, but they do go back to the Pleistocene, the period when humans emerge, Homo sapiens emerges and starts just expanding relentlessly everywhere we can. And this expansion and process of expansion of early humans clearly reverberates back on our health. And malaria is one of the big case studies, because malaria is one of the great human diseases. There are different species of the parasite that causes malaria. The worst one is actually probably younger, probably doesn't evolve until the Holocene, Plasmodium falciparum. But the most widespread form of malaria caused by Plasmodium vivax, which is a very severe disease, is a good example of what we now think is a late Pleistocene. So it's a late Ice Age hunter-gatherer disease that is spread by mosquitoes that really would have weighed heavily on human health even 10, 20,000 years ago.
Kyle, let me ask you a very basic question, which you've answered a bit of it already. So I think in your book you say that basically about half of all chimpanzee deaths are caused by infectious diseases, and about just under 3/4 of hunter-gatherer deaths are caused by, which is a big difference. Is that basically because hunter-gatherers are just moving around much more? Is that the single biggest difference? They're moving around more than chimpanzees are.
Yeah. I mean, I'm using what I think is a very good meta study there. And there's been a lot of work trying to figure out what a chimps die of. Of course, they don't have hospitals and governments, but human observers have looked at different chimp populations very extensively. And so we have a pretty good idea of the demography of chimpanzees and infectious diseases. I'd say this too. Chimps have a lot of germs. If you compare them to other primates and other mammals, everything back in our wing of the family tree,
we're just a bad bit of the family tree, right?
We're the worst. We're the worst bit of a bad bit in general. But hunter gatherers, and again, this is based on a lot of different data points, and there's variability. But hunter gatherers do, most of them, from what we know, die of infectious disease, and it wouldn't be the same infectious diseases that, say, you died of in early industrial Britain. It's probably not tuberculosis and smallpox, but they're dying of low-level respiratory diseases, of worms, which is very underrated as a burden on human health,
and herpes,
of gastroenteric disease. Of what's that?
Herpes.
Herpes is really old. Right. It's been around for millions of years. Yeah. So, and we have two, unlike most primates, we have two species of herpes virus.
Spoil us.
Well adapted to us.
Okay. And so then just for fun, we have the agricultural revolution, and we all start living in shit.
Well, this is one of the interventions I'm trying to make, that we can qualify and should the idea of a Neolithic revolution. It happens in 24 places around the globe. It's not sudden, but it is still the biggest change in human lifestyles in pre-modern times. The ultimate transition from taking our food from wild sources to making our food, to producing it with domesticated plants and animals. And people have talked about the importance of this change for human health in some important ways. It changes diet. It changes patterns of labor, the stress on the human body. But the sort of famous narratives or the big histories of disease have often sort of moved straight from the invention of agriculture to what are sometimes called the crowd diseases or the diseases of civilization, which are all respiratory diseases, like measles and smallpox and so on. So I'm trying to intervene and say that story's not quite right. For one thing, it was developed at a time, I think, before radiocarbon and before we really knew how many thousands of years there were between the transition to agriculture and the rise of civilization and cities. But there's thousands of years in there before you really get large scale states and empires and cities in, say, Mesopotamia in the 4th millennium BC. So that's what's going on in that stretch of time. To me, is you have this change in human lifestyle, change in the way, the settlement structure, the way we live, that isn't yet big cities, but is sedentary. And this is a huge factor in disease ecology, because it means that you're constantly surrounded by your own waste, human waste.
And animal waste.
Humans have this really bad idea. Let's take normally mobile herds of very large bodied mammals that are also constantly moving away from their waste. Let's put them right in our house or yard and make sure that they don't go anywhere and that they're just pooping all around us. Yeah. So, as I say in the book, human settlements in the early Neolithic were, up to that point in time, the single greatest accumulation of interspecies scat in all of nature. There's really nothing like a human settlement that brings together so much crap from so many different animals in such a concentration. And that has a huge effect on our health. The most underrated category of disease in most histories, big histories of infectious disease, is diarrheal disease and dysentery. And it's, to me, this is a crime that all the respiratory diseases are these big, sexy, famous named diseases that everybody knows: whooping cough, diphtheria, measles, smallpox, scarlet fever. Fine, the respiratory diseases are important. They're sexy. They get these names. Whereas the diarrheal diseases don't have a chance, because you can barely even say, shigellosis and paratyphoid fever.
And nobody knows the shits,
well, they're very unglamorous, aren't they?
They're unglamorous.
They're unglamorous diseases.
But they impose a huge burden on human health throughout the past. They would have just been up there with,
and particularly on children,
category.
Right? On young
and
children.
Particularly in children. Because there are lots of them, and the human body will be exposed to them over time and develop some level of immunity. But it's children who are naive immunologically to these diseases. And then, of course, they're Human children are filthy little creatures, and their hygienic habits are extremely questionable.
You've got 4 young children.
I have a lot of them in my house. And speak from personal
it's fingernails,
knowledge.
isn't it? Isn't it fingernails? So when my son was tiny, he scratched my eyeball, and it immediately kind of massively swelled up. And I went to the doctor, and the doctor said, "Yeah, we see this like every day because kids' fingernails, they don't even need to go outside to somehow accumulate enormous quantities of mud under their nails."
Yeah,
Anyway,
they're filthy.
Here's a question for you that might seem a very basic and dumb question. So these people are more sedentary. They're living in kind of little settlements, and they are surrounded by waste. But obviously, that waste, attracts flies, all these kinds of things. And now we would be horrified by it, right? We would be repelled by the stench and the sight and all these kinds of things. How come it doesn't occur to people at the time that this is less than ideal?
No, this is a great question, and I think I think it really challenges you as a historian to try and sympathetically think about the mindset of people in the past. And I think that actually most of our ancestors, they weren't indifferent. They too, your nose tells you when something stinks that it's dangerous. That's hardwired for good reason to tell us to avoid corpses and to avoid waste. Because putrefaction collects all these bacteria that are unpleasant. So there may be really interesting ways in which cultural frames can partly remold the wiring of your sensory perception and your cultural processing of it. But I actually think, the Romans, the early Neolithic people, they must have wanted to avoid some of these smells. And we know that, as soon as people can, they're doing everything they can to get clean water and so on. But so they weren't indifferent, and I don't think we should imagine that they were. But I think they were overwhelmed, and the technology required to ensure clean drinking water is something we can't take for granted. And so I rather try to portray them as in many ways overwhelmed by the forces that are at play, because they need their advantages, economic, social, cultural, spiritual advantages to living in cities. So there's a lot of forces at play here, but also the health threats and risks and challenges of living in dense settlements overwhelm them.
And has it always been the case up until really the past 150 years that cities can only grow if they're replenished by incomers, because they kill?
Yeah, I mean, I think in the big picture, all pre-modern cities are probably more or less giant demographic sinks, that the only way they can sustain their population, much less grow, is by constantly replenishing from the countryside, which tends to be less dense and therefore healthier. And there may be, exceptions on the margins to some of this. And there's some places that have better environments than others. And some cities, the Japanese cities in the early modern times, are pretty interesting in terms of their efforts to maintain clean and healthy environments. But from the very well documented Western societies, the London, the death rate exceeds the birth rate until about 1800. Mm-hmm. And so for London to maintain its size or grow, if the death rate's higher than the birth rate, your population's going down unless there's migration.
Yeah. Okay, let's take a quick break there for some ads, and we will see you in a minute.
This episode is brought to you by the Financial Times. I think we both agree, Dominic, that in the clamour of countless voices competing to break the news and telling you the what, the who, and the where on these stories, there's often something missing, isn't there?
There is, Tom, because I think to get a true understanding of any story, you really need to know why. Take FT journalism. It goes deeper, providing the insight, analysis, and perspective to help you see the whole story and truly understand the issues that matter. Why did it happen? Why is it important? And why will it matter? I've got a brilliant example. So they had an article recently, a fascinating article about why populism became popular. And this Financial Times article absolutely delved into that. It was so interesting.
And does it nail it?
Yeah, it nailed it. Absolutely nailed it. And it really made me look at populism in a new light.
Well, if you're interested in the why we have good news.
Yes, listeners to The Rest is History can save more than 40% on an annual digital subscription to the Financial Times by visiting ft.com/history. For the why, Financial Times.
This episode is brought to you by Rocket Money.
Tom, we often talk about how to organise our finances. I'm very conscious that I'm paying for a lot of mad subscriptions. And there's one thing that we've talked about often on this show. It's the thing that we probably hate more than any other, and it's a hidden fee. I would love to get my finances under control. There are all these things piling up on our bank statements, and I think I need to fix this problem. I need to sort this out and to stop this.
I mean, my finances are so chaotic that I need this app.
So I'll tell you what it is. It's called Rocket Money. It's a personal finance app that helps find and cancel your unwanted subscriptions. It monitors your spending and it helps to lower your bills so that you can grow your savings.
With Rocket Money, you can track all of your subscriptions and you can easily cancel within the app with just a few taps, saving you time, avoiding charges. And you can also set budgets and goals and get personalized insights and regular reports to track how you're doing. They will even send you real-time alerts for large transactions, upcoming bills, refunds, and even low balances. So let Rocket Money help you reach your financial goals faster. Join at rocketmoney.com/ishistory.
That's rocketmoney.com/ishistory. rocketmoney.com/ishistory. Hello, welcome back to The Rest is History. We are still here with Kyle Harper from the University of Oklahoma, and he is telling us about the history of disease. So, Kyle,
You talked about how the advent of the Roman Empire, perhaps counterintuitively to a lot of our listeners, meant that people were shorter because they're fighting off disease. They've got diarrhea when they're young because they're living in cities. Is that true generally, would you say, through most of human history for people who live in cities and large settlements, that they are shorter, smaller than they would otherwise have been if they'd stayed in the fields or whatever?
Yeah, I mean, big picture, I think that is the pattern, that they're skeletons, insofar as skeletons reflect health in different ways. The skeletons tend to be shorter and generally more stressed from urban environments than rural environments. We know that's true all over the Roman Empire, but it's true going back further in time and coming up more recently down to the modern times.
So, Tom, you know why I asked Carl that question? Because you often give me grief in this podcast about not living in London. And now I've been proved completely and utterly right.
No, I'm sorry. Not sorry. Around 1900.
Yeah, it all changes, Dominic. Get with the speed.
It flips. Somewhere in the early 20th century, you're
the deep continuities of human history prove me right, Tom.
No, the metropolitan elite get better health, and the peasants, I'm afraid, are left behind. That's the lesson of history, Dominic, and you can't argue with it. But of course, the most famous plague pandemic is in the 14th century, the Black Death. How do you think that the impact of the Black Death, compares to the Justinianic plague or to any other pandemic experience before the Black Death?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I really wanted to do in writing a history of disease is to broaden the canvas and make sure that we're not just focusing on the big sexy diseases, whether it's kind of these lesser known diarrheal diseases or worm diseases or particularly tropical diseases that sometimes European or American historians don't pay very much attention to because they're maybe not the sort of local history diseases. But even so I comment this from a perspective where not inclined to put plague at the top of the pyramid of wildly crazy, insanely deadly diseases, but it's there. I mean, I still just am struck in looking at the whole swath of the history of infectious disease and how hard it really is to wrap your mind around bubonic plague. So the plague caused by the bacterial disease Yersinia pestis. It's hard to understand how something could exist that causes so much disease and so much death so quickly.
So
over
how much
such
death?
Scales?
What is the current thinking on how much death it does cause?
In the Black Death, I'm a Roman historian who's perennially jealous of scholars working in the late Middle Ages and early modern periods, because you still have pre-industrial societies, but you have more of a documentary record. And, in places like Italy, you have really rich record from civic governments, and in England as well, and then increasingly from church records. So we actually have more of a basis than we do in the Roman Empire. And there's been a ton of work on the Black Death. And it doesn't, there's not like a sort of quotient that it hits everywhere it goes. I mean, there's one amazing, I use this one manor record from the south of England in the book that has been studied, where you have this amazing list of people, workers on these villages from 1347 and 1349. It's just like this granular look at the arrival of the plague. And there are little like hamlets or something where it's killing nobody. There are hamlets that's killing everybody. So we're talking about an average of a spread. But the work on the Black Death, there used to be canonically that it killed a third to a half, which I always think is kind of funny because it's sort of like just got ingrained. And there's all this history work that just says third to half, third to half, third to half. And that's not bad, but it's still pretty big spread. And anywhere there's like a ton of detailed evidence, it really is more like half. And it's usually these over times, historians like to be critical and these big claims get kind of broken up. But actually what's weird about the study of the Black Death is that hasn't in a lot of ways really happened. I mean, there was definitely variability, but if anything, the older estimates tend to be on the lower end of what we think. So over really large areas, it's killing half the population.
And the thing is, we sort of take the Black Death for granted. We're familiar with the iconography, but we don't really probably think enough about what that must have meant. I mean, 1 in every 2 people is killed. If you've got 20 friends, 10 of them are dead. If you've got 4 kids, 2 of them are dead. And the other 2 will probably die anyway, something else.
It's mind-boggling.
So this is the most cataclysmic event in human history?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there used to be, now this is a useful contrast, the Columbian Exchange, so the arrival of European explorers and conquerors in the New World following Christopher Columbus. There used to be the idea that these unleashed these sudden huge pandemics that also killed 50, 60, 70% of the population. Obviously, I think the introduction of European and African diseases to the New World is hugely important and killed massive numbers of people. And that you can't talk about European expansion and colonialism without the biology of infectious disease. But those numbers don't stand up. There were some really, really big pandemics. And over the course of a century, there may have been that level of population change. But none of the say 16th century pandemics that we can follow were quite the same magnitude as the Black Death. Now, I still think they're sort of in that tier of the most destructive disease events in history. But I would say that the plague pandemics at their worst seem to just have a kind of scale and magnitude that we don't see in other events.
And Carl, obviously, if you live in England, I guess also in America, the focus of the Black Death is Europe, particularly Latin Christendom. But there's a kind of a growing interest in the scale and the scope of the spread of the Black Death across Asia as well, isn't there? And there is research being done recently suggesting that it actually spread the century before in the wake of the Mongols. Is that right?
Yeah, there's all sorts of really interesting scholarship happening right now, partly driven by the ability to draw from genetics as a source for understanding the evolutionary history of these pathogens. And it's really reopened really the question of like, how big was the Black Death chronologically and spatially? And certainly there's a lot going on in the evolutionary history of the bacterium, about 3 generations before the Black Death. And this is interesting because it really, I think, even deepens the overlap with the Mongol expansion and the establishment of Mongol empires in the 13th century. So that's a really interesting angle. And then I think we're living in a time where there's a lot more global history that doesn't sort of just start with Europe. England. I mean, England is sort of the very fringe of what's happening in the Black Death. And it comes from Central Asia. We always, even without the genetic evidence, the Arabic language evidence for the Black Death is extraordinary. And we know as richly what happens in Egypt as we do from Western Europe. So it's a story that always should have been.
But China
inclusive.
is interesting, isn't it? Because there the evidence is more ambivalent.
Yeah, and it's hard for me as a scholar because the language in East Asia are so inaccessible to me. And there's a huge level of interest and a lot of debate going on now. And there's smart, informed people who seem to be on both sides of this. So it's very hard for kind of an outsider to really know, are these attestations of pestilence in China in the 13th century, is that part of the Black Death or the big bubonic plague pandemic? Or is it not? And I really am unconvinced that either side has the decisive win in this argument right now. But it's one of the things we are going to find out. It's exciting. We need to know. It's really cool to try and ask. If it does get to China, then it widens the scope of this pandemic. If it doesn't, then we need to ask, why wasn't it there? And for instance, in South Asia too, I think we don't fully know, but I would say there the balance of the evidence still suggests that the Black Death doesn't get to India in the 14th century, and we don't really have a good explanation for that.
But it was big and bad.
It was big and bad where it was, for sure.
Yeah. Now, that is the end of today's episode, but tune in tomorrow when we'll have the next installment, or alternatively, you could always join the Rest is History Club at restishistorypod.com, and you'll get it straight away. We never miss a promotional opportunity. Anyway, for the time being, it's goodbye from me, and it's goodbye from him.
Thanks for listening to The Rest is History. For bonus episodes, early access, ad-free listening, and access to our chat community, please sign up at restishistorypod.com. That's restishistorypod.com.